Good morning, everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning in our day 2 of the Time Between the Old and New Testament short study. Today, we are in the Hellenistic period that ranged from 336 to 165 BC. Many interesting things happened during this time. With the fall of Persia to Alexander the Great, the age of the great Eastern empires had ended. Western might came to dominate the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Indeed, the Greek Empire became the largest the world had ever seen, extending even into Western India. So as you remember yesterday, we were talking about the Persian period, and you had Babylon, the Assyrians, all this stuff. This was now outdone by Alexander the Great. Although Alexander the Great died young, and that was amidst suspicious circumstances, his empire continued to rule of his generals who split it into 4 sections, which was Ptolemy Soter claimed both Egypt and Israel. So you had a divided up thing once Alexander the Great had passed into 4 different smaller sections. Politically, little had changed for the Jews under the Greek and the Ptolemaic rule. They continued to live and worship under the authority of a distant and foreign ruler, much as they had for generations. You've seen this in the Old Testament where they were being ruled by, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians. You notice history repeating itself. Certain things continually to happen. Culturally, at this point, though, however, they became more and more influenced by the Greek or the Hellenistic civilization. So, although you've had blending in the past in the Old Testament, you've seen this with pagan acceptance, intermarriage, and then pagan worship, a little bit of a shift starts to happen, or I guess you could say kind of a similar thing that had happened in the past. Alexander's strategy for preserving his empire had been to unite the diverse, subjugated peoples around a common culture. Well, that's interesting. Where have we heard that before? The Ptolemaic dynasty carried out this policy with vigor, promoting Greek language and thought by all possible means. So pretty much you have a way of bringing a group of people that's kingdoms was, taken over. How can you get them to be accepting of this new rule? Well, you try to blend them into it. You force it down their throats. Thousands of Jews were forcibly resettled in Alexandria. All right? Although Jews both at home and abroad resisted adapting to Greek religion, they couldn't escape all aspects of Hellenistic influence. They soon began to speak Greek, the trade language of the empire, and their worship came to reflect the Greek preference for aesthetics over content. So here you have a change to where it's no longer about the actual content or reality. You make something aesthetically pleasing. Also out of this period, you see a lot of mythology. What we call mythology, that was their worship. And as we get into a certain thing, what was I going to say? With Antiochus, who was making sacrifices to these things. This mythology wasn't some harmless thing, or they believed in this and they were antiquated. No, it's pagan worship. And you start to see it. Pagan worship's always been around. It just changes form and name. And it still exists to this day, which is disturbing, which is why so many people are led down all these different paths, thinking it's, it's okay. So what ends up happening is you have the most important thing, a faith shift based on aesthetically pleasing worship. You start to see, more statues, things like this. More significantly, a group of Jewish scholars during this time translated the Old Testament from its Hebrew into Greek. So now you have a shifting of the word going from Hebrew into Greek. So now it's starting to permeate other languages. So as one thing is rising, so is something else, okay? This was called the Septuagint. This Greek translation came to be widely used by Jews everywhere, and Jesus himself later quoted from the Septuagint, as did many of the New Testament authors. So you see a spreading, and this is obviously before the gospel of Jesus Christ, but you see a spreading of the Old Testament through the Septuagint, and now it's translated from not just Hebrew, but also in Greek. So now it's in multiple languages, so people are starting to be able to read about the Old Testament. In 198 BC, the Syrian section of the empire overthrew the Egyptian section. For the first time, Israel came under the rule of a leader who tried to stamp out Judaism completely. So now you have a time, you have a ruler that's come into power that is trying to annihilate, all right, Judaism. You could look back in the not so distant past as to what Hitler was trying to do. See, there's nothing new under the sun. And when you start to look at this gap, not a gap in time, but this bridging between the Old and New Testaments, many things make sense both back then and now. Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, we've talked about him in the past. We're getting into more depth now. He desecrated the temple. He forbade sacrifices to Yahweh. He outlawed circumcision. He forced Jews to eat pork and canceled Sabbaths and feast days. So, you have an interesting thing that's happened here. How do you know that mythology was truly what they were worshiping? Well, Antiochus, in his defiling of the temple, or placing the abomination where it ought not be, sacrificed a pig to Zeus on the altar. So you see multiple offenses at one time happening. So these aren't just things when people, listen, I can speak back to when I was taught mythology. It was like a joke, not realizing people were worshiping this. It was pagan worship. And that's no different from worshiping Baal, is no different from worshiping Dagon. It's no different than worshiping some of the stuff today. That's not Jesus. You start to see an overlapping theme. When you're born into something, it's very difficult to see outside of that. So, think of the Israelites that were brought into this civilization. As their generation started to go down, they started to merge into it because the kids just knew what they were born into. And as their faith started to become more watered down as time went on, they didn't know. And you see this with cultural change now. I've seen this plenty of times when people come to this country, they're holding on to their culture, the elder generation. As the kids start to come, they start adopting the new generation more and more and more and more, and they start distancing themselves from their initial culture, in some regards, hating it. You see this a lot with faith. So you can start to see what the Hellenistic period was happening under Alexander the Great and how that empire kept doing this as time went on. And then as soon as people had come out, unless they were taught the truth, they were going on about their business. Now, a little more into what Antiochus did. This is mentioned in both Daniel and Mark. So you have the Old and New Testament, right? The Old Testament and then the New Testament paralleling, right? Not contradicting. So in Daniel, and we can see this in 31. Now, this is something that happened multiple times. So it's not, well, it just happened, it's done. And even if it did happen, you start to see what period we're in. This happened with Antiochus. It happened with Titus in 70 AD. So these are things that are consistently happening. And then you start to see what's going on in this generation. Daniel chapter 11, verse 31, "An arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." Okay, so you see that with Antiochus, with what he started to employ, taking away prayer, taking away circumcision. He outlawed it. He forced Jews to eat pork. These were all the things that were, against their faith. And it was a forced change. In Mark, when we go ahead to Mark, you can see this same thing, where it talks about, and this is in Mark, let's go to chapter 13, verse 13. "And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake, but he that shall endure until the end, the same shall be saved. But when ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet." Well, that's interesting. So you have something from the past that's relevant in the present and relevant in the future. That's the word of God. It's alive. Let's finish this off. "Standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand them. Let him that be in Judea flee to the mountains." So you have an event that's happened, was happening, and is going to happen. That's hard for people sometimes to wrap their head around. They just think it's, that's, something that's not going to happen again. Have you ever heard the thing, history repeats itself? So with Antiochus, some Jews attempted to conciliate Antiochus and cooperate with his demands. Others resisted. So you see a divide. Some people went along with it Others resisted it. And these two groups were known as the Hellenists and the Hasidim, which were the pious ones. These were the forerunners of the Pharisees. So you start to see out of what condition these branches of belief were formed. Okay? You start to understand where that came from. There was also a group that was loyal to the high priest that emerged, and these were the precursors of the Sadducees. So now you see the formation, the original formation of the Pharisees and the Sadducees out of Antiochus's reign. Now the conflict in Israel finally reached a boiling point when an elderly priest named Matthias refused to offer a required pagan sacrifice. Matthias killed a Syrian officer and a reprobate Jew. He fled to the hills and called faithful Jews everywhere to join him in a rebellion. During the ensuing guerrilla war, Matthias' son, Judas Maccabeus, eventually overcame the Syrians and achieved independence for Israel. It's the last period of self-rule until the emergence of the modern state of Israel in 1948. So you see, very, very interesting thing. Again, something repeating itself. Independence of Israel then and now. And when we get into the Maccabean period tomorrow, that ranged from 165 to 63. And you see how the independence was, short-lived and disastrous. But, again, I like this study segment because you start to see any gaps get filled in real quick of connecting the Old and New Testament, bridging that gap, and just giving you some basic history of what was going on and how it relates to now.